everyone know I'm going to share my desktop. So in a moment, you're going to see a PowerPoint pop up on your screen. And hopefully that has happened right now. And you may recognize that this looks a lot like the starting point for Andrew's presentation at our annual meeting 2 weeks ago. So what I'm going to do is actually take us into a little greater depth on those finances. And before I get started, I want to let everyone know John, in his Sunday announcement, included a link to our financial package. So if you want to see the full financial package and have a copy of that, just go to the link at the at his 7 a.m. Email, and you can pull down that full financial package. We are also going to have somewhat simplified charts to talk to today to go into some greater detail into this. And I'm going to ask also if Andrew Gustafson, are you here today?
Present.
Excellent. If you could monitor the chat and collect questions that come up, as I'm going through things, if you have questions, Andrew can gather them, and then I'll have Andrew feed the questions into me so that I can answer them as we go on the financial presentation. I do want to acknowledge the people who are on Finance Committee and make such wonderful contributions. We've met more consistently and more frequently this year than in any year I can remember. And a big shout out to Kathy Araujo. Kathy, for those of you who don't know, is our database expert. She enters every single bill, every single gift that we receive into the database, and she is the most fabulous go-to person. So thank you, Kathy. A person you don't see is Sebastian Decio, who is, I don't know if we've given him a formal title, but I'll call him our financial accountant. He is a contract person and was not joining us today because he is with his Catholic Church today. But he is the person who is making sure that the books work correctly. Peter Freeman, all of you know Peter, and Peter is our longest serving member of Finance Committee and a former Finance Committee chair. Andrew Gustafson, and Andrew is our Vestry liaison. So Andrew has really gotten steeped in his first year on Vestry in our finances. Randy Lewandowski, for those of you who may not be aware, Randy is actually the St. John's treasurer. So he's the person whose name gets to be placed on all filings with state authorities. And he is the one who is sort of the final impression that, yes, this is correct. And our newest member, Ed Likely, who started with St. John's 2 or 3 weeks before the lockdown hit. So Ed has been, it's been terrific to bring Ed on board, and he is starting to get steeped into church finances right now. So that's a little bit about our team. I want to talk a little bit about the agenda. I'm going to start by going through sort of a medium level of detail on 3 budgets. I mean, we talk about the budget. We don't actually have just one budget. We spend out of 3 different locations. The one we tend to refer to as the budget is our church operating budget. This is, in most years, the biggest of the budgets where most of the spending comes out. This is the budget that's actually managed through the Vestry. They approve that budget, they get monthly updates and make adjustments as appropriate. But we also have a second budget, which is restricted funds, gifts that we receive from congregants with any kind of restriction on how it's to be spent. And that level of budget activity in some years, in a few rare years, has been our biggest budget. So for example, when we had the Great Flood, and we had to put out all that money on fixing the church, our church operating budget and our restricted budget had similar outflows. But because those budgets are restricted by the person who gave the money those don't tend to be boundaried by Vestry guidance. They're bound by the guidance of the individual donor. And the third budget, and this is the one that people who gave in are very interested in, and people who have never given into it or not, is the time to build up. This was our fund to manage the building project, the bridge project that's gone by many, many names over the years. So those are the three budgets, and we're going to touch base on each of those. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the balance sheet. It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's the statement of assets and liabilities, but I want to sort of figure out, like, tying the year together. How are we? How solid is our foundation financially at the end of the year, and how did that compare to the beginning of the year? And then we're going to take just a single slide to talk about the budgeting challenges in 2021. We're not going to review next year's budget because it hasn't been presented to the Vestry yet. And the Vestry needs to put their hands on it, because we're going to hand them a budget gap like we do in most years. And then you stretch revenue up and stretch expenses down and get the thing to meet, and try to get to a balanced budget. And then at the end, we're going to have plenty of time for any questions, answers, or I say parking lots, because if we get a question that we can't give a full and complete answer on, I'm going to set it to the side and make sure that we can get back to the person who asked that. I hope that makes sense for everyone. And if it doesn't, just make a comment and Andrew can tap me on the shoulder. As context for the year, this was a different year. It was a different year from the start of the year to the end of the year. We started the year with this big investment we decided to make in congregational development. That meant bringing on a full-time congregational development person. That's our friend John Owens. It meant big requests for big growth in pledges, and the congregation met that pledge with an 18% growth in pledges. It also meant that Vestry got to work in a way I've never seen a Vestry do, which is to figure out how do we bridge the rest of that gap, which they did with a couple of wonderful initiatives to grow our non-residential rent income. The biggest one being bringing on a Montessori school, but also an initiative to rent out some of the flexible space that we had in the education building and the sanctuary. And those two things individually accounted for roughly a little bit over $50,000 worth of our operating budget. So, kudos to the Vestry and kudos to the congregation. That was an unusually good start to the year. The other thing that happened the start of the year, we had a level of prepayments that we'd never seen before. We had almost $100,000 paid in before January 1st hit in 2020 on the pledges. And if you think you have about $500,000 in pledges, we had about 20% of the money in before the year started. That was about a 50% growth rate versus the year before. So that was a really terrific thing. It meant we started the year in a very good financial position. And then we had the COVID pivot, and all of a sudden the world changed. And in the beginning of COVID, this was a day by day and a week by week thing as we were learning what this would mean. And quite frankly, it was a little scary. We watched in a period of 1 month, unemployment in the United States go from under 4% to almost 15%. And that was in 1 month that we made that leap. And there was a lot of real concern about, are you going to have the cash throughout the year to make your payments and meet your needs? Is our pledge stream of cash, is that going to be strong enough? And what's going to happen to our rental income, both on our residential properties and our non-residential properties? And with the government talking about the potential for 20 to 40% unemployment, it was a time period that you could hear the gears of the economy grinding to a halt. So we really had two focuses. One, make sure we have the cash that we're going to need to sustain operations. And two, do contingency planning on what happens to the budget during the course of the year. On the cash management piece, something that people, may have picked up in our first cottage meetings, we talked about the fact that we applied for a PPP loan from the SBA. PPP stands for Paycheck Protection Loan, which starts out as an interest-free loan that can be forgiven. And that loan was designed to make sure that people did not lay off people. That's Paycheck Protection Program. And so we made a small loan to make sure we had enough cash to get through if we lost our non-residential rent income and we suffered weakness in our pledge income. We also put 3 plans together: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And our goal was, the good is going to be hard to land on, but if we could only land between the good and the bad, we would be okay. And that was sort of our goal. And no one really wants to look at the ugly plan. How we ended the year was really, really sort of wonderful. I mean, a lot of us watched this year as the year started with the financial markets going into a plummet and then ending up the year on a record. And that's not dissimilar with what our accomplishments were for the year. We sustained full staffing the entire year. We maintained a good level of congregational engagement. And it was interesting, if you looked at attendance at our Zoom meeting on Easter, we actually, I think, did more in our Zoom service than we did at the 11 o'clock service last year. So we had a high level of engagement. The ministries all functioned during the course of the year. We had new initiatives to improve the appearance and the functionality of the campus. And if you haven't been by, take a look at the new signage, take a look at where the meditation garden is right now, take a look at our new fence along the route, take a look at what's been removed on hazardous trees, and you'll see that there were really wonderful things that happened. We ended the year with very good cash balances. So we're starting this year in as strong a position as we started last year. And we closed our budget to within the proximity of where we wanted it. We landed the budget between good and bad, exactly where we wanted. So those were all, I think, terrific things. And I'm going to do a couple quick highlights. I think you can probably see my arrow twirling here. So if you want to follow my arrow. In our contributed income, we ended up in our total income from individuals exceeding our number. We actually were just a little bit short on pledge income, but we exceeded in special offerings. And quite frankly, part of that is the monies that came in for the Festival of Lights. We received $8,500 of contributions towards Festival of Lights in December. And that was money that was largely unbudgeted. We had thought that we were going to have lower income coming in off of our grants this year, and our grants ended up being fairly solid. And we transferred what we expected in auctions. And as the year turned out, we actually made a little money off our cash investments. And so we ended up exceeding our contributed revenue goal by $16,000. Now, there's a word of caution there, which is we started with a starting budget. That was where we were in the beginning of the year. In June, we decided that budget had changed enough, that conditions did, that we really needed to revise the budget and make that our new operating budget. So there's the revised mid-year budget. And there's where we actually came in. So when we measure this fourth column difference versus the mid-year, that's a measure of this mid-year budget. That's what we're talking about. So we were a little shy of what we expected in the beginning of the year, but versus where we were at the middle, we did much better. If you look on personnel and assessments, and this is important to understand about our budget, we spend in a year a little over $700,000. But $572,000 of that is personnel and assessments, and those are largely fixed things for us. As long as we maintain full employment, the rate that we compensate at least some of our clergy is governed by the diocese. So if you look at our total budget, we're over 70% of our budget goes into personnel. We pay an assessment to the diocese of about $90,000 a year, and that is fixed at the beginning of the year. So the place that we tend to have most of our discretion on expenses is a much smaller area of administrative and program expense. The interesting thing during this year is that we were able to come in under our expense budget on personnel and assessments without any reduction in our numbers. And you may say, how did you do that? Most of this is a little trick. We moved into a different relationship with our sexton. In the past, we had a W-2 sexton. She concluded her services at the end of last year, and we brought in a contract sexton. As we got into this year, we realized that, cleaning the church, emptying the trash was actually a lower hour plan. And we decided to take some of our new sexton's time, Dan, who actually happens to be a pretty handy man, and have him do some maintenance work for us and keeping up the campus. And so we had some savings in personnel because we applied that to sexton. We had some overages in maintenance because we shifted some of that spending into maintenance, and that falls into an administrative expense. Actually, that whole position pretty whole, and I think we benefited the church in the process. Nonetheless, we had good savings versus our revised budget in administrative and program expenses. So on an operating basis, we beat our budget by $24,000. You come down to this last area, rent revenue. That's the place we were really short, and we're going to go into some detail on that. But the net for the year, we had a loss of $3,533 against a revised mid-year budget for us to have a loss of about $27,000, and we had considered that $27,000 very manageable. So we improved by $23,000. So we looked at that and said, this is a good place to net for the year. In some drill downs on expenses, I talked a little bit about the fact that we had some savings in sexton. And you'll notice we actually picked up down here in insurance, utilities, maintenance, and taxes. You'll see that we actually took our initial budget, instead of reducing it, we increased it. And when we did that for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to be honest about where we thought we were going to net out. And we knew we had reapplied some of our sexton into that area. That was part of it. The other part of it was getting the church up to speed to have the right infrastructure to be able to conduct Zoom meetings, not just our Sunday Zoom meetings, but have to actually have more capacity for the ministries to be able to operate during the weeks. And so we made investments in some pretty mundane things like new conduits so that we can put more wires where they need to go, some new equipment, an expanded Zoom account. We shifted our providers for our telecommunications, which involves some exit fees and some surprise billings, I'll say. AT&T is not my friend right now. But as a result, we actually put a little bit more money in there, and then we still saved against that revised budget. One kudo to the Vestry in here. We actually started the year expecting to have a lower amount of money spent in insurance because we were revising our insurance contracts. The timing didn't work out to meet that initial budget, but at mid-year we had switched those contracts, and we are accruing significant savings in our overall insurance by making that shift. So thank you to the Vestry, and I believe an individual call out to Ian Storer for that. And then we had savings in total worship programs. And you may wonder, well, you brought your budget from 24/7 down to 17/3 and you came in at 5,500. When we did this mid-year budget, we thought we would probably be reopening at the church in September. And so we figured, well, we're going to have some startup costs, et cetera, to bring programs back up to running. And of course, the reality was we were shut down for live service the whole time. And that's part of the big reason you see that big reduction, because, and this is everything. This is flowers, altar guild, and religious supplies. These kinds of things are all much less music when you aren't live and in person. So there was a really healthy savings there. Similarly, conducting youth programs online has cost less. And so we had savings there. Kudos to the stewardship group. There was one thing that we were insistent on, which was we were going to give Nancy Coe and her group the money they needed to run an effective stewardship campaign. And so we kept that budget at historically high levels of $7,000. They significantly underspent that budget and delivered tremendous results. We still have some stewardship coming in. We are now a little over $3,000 short of our goal of $525,000, which would, I believe, be the highest we'd ever raised. So we have done wonders there, and we still are receiving pledges. So I'm very hopeful that we will actually meet that budget goal. And then for communications and outreach, this is one place it's like, oh, the number went up. And again, that's a good thing. We did not really reduce that much in our mid-year budget rebudgeting because outreach is so important and building our congregational development. The really significant changes here, we're bringing in the Festival of Lights, but also improving some of the communications during this particular time period. So, and this is also an area that will be an investment area going into next year. So that's a quick summary. We ended up in operating expenses $24,000 better than we had expected. Now comes sort of the place and the reason that we had very high levels of anxiety about what might happen during the course of the year, and that is in our rent income. So if you take a look, we get over $100,000 a year in net rent income. That's rent net expenses. And so that's a big part of our budget impact. We had a starting budget for residential rent income of $161,000. We lowered it slightly because we had one tenant who had made a request for some assistance, and we negotiated that. What was actually finalized was a little better than that, and so we came within $1,000 of the original budget and $2,400 better, and we had stable rentals through the year. In our non-residential rent income, though, this is where we have AA, music together. This is renting out the education building and parts of the sanctuary. We had an aggressive budget of $65,000. It was a big increase from the prior year of $17,000, and it was really, we were going to deliver on that number. I felt good about that number, and I'm sure Vestry did as well. We revised that mid-year to $33,000 because we thought we would be reopening the church in the fall and we would get income from a couple of the groups, and we were still planning on a delayed opening on Montessori. Where we actually ended up the year was $13,000. So we were $20,000 below our revised budget, but think about this. We took a $50,000 hit, or a little over a $50,000 hit in non-residential rent income. And we still managed to keep the budget in a good place during the course of the year. I do want everyone to know, and again, I applaud our Vestry on this. Montessori started operations at St. John's in December. Because of the nature of COVID, it's coming in with a smaller class size. We were negotiated a somewhat smaller rental fee because it's not taking as many square feet. But they're up and running, and they should be an income source for all 12 months moving into 2021. We do enforced savings, which is a really nice thing in our budget. So you see a subtraction. We do the maintenance reserve. We did not feel tempted in the budgets to schnitzel that number down. We reserve the amount of money that we traditionally believe that we will need for maintenance on the properties. And understand, by the way, that maintenance in this case is not like, oh, the toilet's clogged or I need to fix a drip on the plumbing. These are big things like a roof replacement's needed, or something with the driveway, or a sewer lateral needs to be redone. We reserve every year to be able to handle those kinds of things, and we did exactly as we planned on that. So net, with all the puts and takes, we ended up about $17,000 below a revised budget, and over $40,000 versus the original budget on that. So does that make sense to everyone? And Andrew, have you seen any questions at this point?
The only question that came up was Susan asking if the Festival of Lights was the drive-through, known as the drive-through. And yes, I just affirm, in case that was anyone else's question, the drive-through indeed was the same as the Festival of Lights.
Yeah,
that's it.
And that drive-through, Andrew, I don't know if your memory is different than mine. I think we had something over 600 cars go through that drive-through, and we did a collection, collected an initial $5,000 from a pledging family, and then we brought in another 3,500. It was, I think, a really positive thing. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the second budget. This is the one that's the donor restricted budget. We have, over the years, built up a lot of different funds. The whole list of funds takes a full page with normal typing. So I have clustered them into youth and education, in-reach, outreach, grounds and maintenance, and worship. And one of our goals, we love having these funds, but we want to make sure that those funds get spent. And so one of the goals is to try to at least, have the same amount, the money that comes in equals the money going out. And actually, over time, we'd actually like to see if we can spend faster, because people who make those restricted donations have an intent that that money gets used. In youth and education, we brought in $7,500. We had restricted expenses of $6,000 and an ending balance of $10,600. In this case, the reason our restricted expenses were lower than we might have expected is because a lot of this money is behind youth mission trip. And obviously that trip didn't take place, but some of those, that money are still reserved in future. In InReach, the biggest spending here is really out of Rector's discretionary fund and the Toy Scholarship Fund and the COVID-19 funds. And so we would expect actually in this year to have seen good spending on that, and we did. We had $15,500 in restricted revenue, which was a good inflow, but we had a healthy outflow of $21,000, and we have a remaining balance of $41,000. Outreach, you tend to see this every year as being pretty even. This is where people have designated oftentimes pass-through gifts, but it also includes gifts for sacred space. And so, yes, Uganda, for example, funds would go in as revenue and get spent out as expense on this. One of the things that I will be asking our financial accountant to look at is to make sure that, given that this number was bigger coming in than this one, if we have any delayed expenditures, that we move those out quickly. On grounds, maintenance, and improvement, this is our biggest balance fund, which is terrific. This is the fund, by the way, that was huge a few years ago to handle the Great Flood. But we got some wonderful gifts in, and one large anonymous donor gift that helped boost that. And there are a lot of plans for the building improvement and the grounds improvement funds. And so we started spending those monies this year. We actually spent almost 17,000 out. There is certainly a large demand for these funds, and I would expect to see in the coming year that we were going to be looking for ways to continue to spend in this area. In our worship, we also received a lovely new donation, which is going to be very badly needed to support organ improvements and maintenance. And so that is a fund that has started. I'm sure that particular donor would welcome any additional gifts into this area, and it gives us a lot of flexibility to for the music program that they might not normally have. And that's the big change in worship. Because the church was closed, we actually didn't have a lot of restricted expenses this year. And then there's down here something called Vestry designated funds. So these funds are actually funds that the Vestry voted in here, take some funds and have them for a future purpose. So they include things like when we do an auction, we tend to split the income into two, use half of it one year and then restrict the other half to be used the next year. And we received $15,000 in here. Most of that was maintenance reserve. From our rental properties. We had significant restricted expenses. Part of this was moving the auction funds over. This was year 2, the year we used the second year of the auction funds. And also it represents, we spent on maintenance this year a little over $19,000. If we look at it, the total was we got about $90,000 in and we sent about $90,000 out. We kept that basic balance going, but we've had discussions with Vestry and the officers of the church about working to see what we can do to manage, to start lowering some of our fund balances and apply more of the gifts that come in a more expedient fashion. So happy where that is, and I think there's more opportunity in this budget in the future. And then I'm going to just take a quick comment on time to build up, and then I'll stop it to see if there's more questions at this point. We were ramping up and getting ready to do the capital fundraising effort for our big grounds improvement projects, bringing the driveway in from Thornhill Boulevard, etc. In 2019, we were doing a lot of work with consultants, finalizing the plans, doing a lot of work on permits and fees. And in 2019, we had a big outflow from the time to build up. Now, these funds are totally separate. They are segregated from the rest of the church budgets, and they can only be used on this one thing. This year, of course, we were expecting to continue to ramp up, and launching the capital campaign, we estimate is going to be about a $50,000 investment to get that designed, launched, and running. So we started the year running and quickly moved to a slow trot to a stop. And so these numbers reflect that, which is across the board, both in new monies coming in and monies going out. We put this into, I'm going to call it hibernation. And our expenses by either April or May, we had received the last of expenses. So this is easy when we do the monthly financials. All the numbers tend to be zeros, except for a couple donors who continue to send a small amount of money in. So we had $47,000 in spending, and we had a halt. The project is hibernated. As we move into reopening the church, there will be a lot of new discussion on this. And in that base time to build up account, I mentioned that you want $50,000 to be able to do it. We had a target of keeping the time to build up account at least above 50,000. And I believe that account ends up around $60,000 today. So we also achieved that objective. And Andrew, are there any questions on that?
Well, I think I hope everyone saw. I mean, it's not directly related to what you just talked about, but there was a question in the chat from Susan about the Montessori contract, expected revenue from that for the year. You mentioned, that's our anticipation, and I just sort of gave more detail about how the current contract is through August 31st. And as you said, it's at a reduced rate given the enrollment of the Montessori is less right now. We're quite confident, though, that as with most of the Bay Area, there's lots of demand for childcare. And so we would hope that when we renegotiate that, as we approach end of August, that we could get a better rent rate. So that's our hope, but then this is all pending COVID too.
Yeah, and Andrew, refresh my memory. What is the rate we're currently getting in?
Yeah, I was just going to check on that too, because I'm going to correct myself here if I'm wrong, but I think it's around $2,800 a month right now. I'm going to correct myself if I'm wrong, though.
Okay, I was going to say it's about $3,000 a month.
It's about that. And then the only other question, I'm just trying to pull a couple of questions from David that we can touch on. But if there's a couple more bits of information to share, I'll try to sort of get those questions lined up so we can address those.
Okay, and I think some of David's questions may tie into balance sheet. So maybe it would make sense for me to move into balance sheet, and then we can move on. So my two questions, like it's the end of the year. We've seen what the individual budgets look like. How does the balance sheet look like? Did we end up in a good cash position? Those are two questions I hear. I love it when Gordon Everett says, we want a rock solid balance sheet. And for those of you who are not well versed in financial terms, a balance sheet typically is measuring sort of like, what do we have, the assets we have, what are the liabilities, what among those assets, which are pledged to which ones need to fulfill loans, which ones are going to be accounts payable, which ones have to back up a restriction from a donor, those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, how much do you still have left in a business term? It would be called retained earnings. Our term is called working capital. And you want that to be a positive, not a negative number. And one of the things, and Lila was the one who changed the terminology on this, and she was right. We now call our statement not the balance sheet, but a statement of assets and liabilities, because our statement of assets and liabilities in church finance doesn't look like a regular business. For example, and this is probably financially the biggest thing, I always remind people of this, we own 3 residential properties. Those properties have very real value today. Those properties do not show up as an asset on our balance sheet. They show up with the diocese. If we ever go to sell it, the diocese says, yes, go ahead and sell, then we would get the cash in and that would show up as our assets. But while it is property, it does not show up on our balance sheet, nor does our church itself. So if we're thinking about like, what do we really have? We have significantly more than ever shows up on our assets and liabilities in reality. And that's merely one of the differences, but it is my cautionary statement on why you want to talk about, well, let's take a look at the assets and liabilities. So let's take a look at the assets. I've broken this up, and this is a little different than what you will see in the the church financial package that John distributed a link on. And I chose to cluster things because it was an easier way for me to talk it. We have a combination of things that tie to our regular church operating budget. So I call that church cash and the investment accounts excluding the capital campaign and the endowment. So these are assets that we can apply towards our regular daily ongoing operations. We closed this year at 373,952. That was an excellent number to close on. That was a $50,000 improvement. And you may say, well, you had a $3,000 loss. How do you end up with a $50,000 improvement on that? The biggest part of that is the fact that we have the PPP loan that we got from the SBA. So we actually see an increase. Good news is we held on to a lot of that cash and we're in a fine cash position. In our capital campaign, we spent $47,000. Now that's different, a little different than this 44.8. There's something on the transfers between the accounts that show in the liability. So we actually have a little bit different number in our change for the total accounting here, but we have $60,000 in our capital campaign bucket as of December 31st. At this point, with the transfers that are in the liability side, we probably have about a little over 59,000. And we maintained the 50,000 we wanted to re-engage the capital campaign with. And then we have our endowment investments. And our endowment investments, much like much of the investment world, performed very nicely during the course of the year. We now have an endowment of about $189,000, and we grew that 25,000. And we had prepaid retreats and expenses. We cleaned this up. We kept those on board that are things as soon as the church reopens that we can re-engage on. But those things that were from past events, we made sure we had cleared that up. And so we actually lowered that. And our total current assets ended up increasing about $25,000. Given how we were feeling in March and April, I don't think any of us would have predicted that we would have ended up with quite that good a position. So we feel good about the position we started in. You know, just on the liability side, and assets and liabilities always have to meet. We had accrued expenses, payroll, and pension contributions. These are things that you, on an exception basis, you say they're in last year's budget, but the bill's coming in January. And, you know, when you reduce that, you've actually paid more of your expenses in the year you intended them to be in. So that's actually makes your start of the year cash-wise a little bit better. We have the SBA loan. It was a $69,000 loan. By the way, if this loan gets forgiven, and we believe it will, this amount will come from this line here, and it will end up showing on the budget as a government grant, but it'll end up moving into working capital here on the balance sheet, meaning that's our version of retained earnings. Prepaid rents and pledges. Almost all of this amount is prepaid pledges. It's down a little bit from last year, but last year was a record. And so we kept up at a historic high level for prepayment of pledges. That number on January 1st, January 31st, I can't touch that cash because that's base for the next year, 2021. But on January 1st, that number 2 comes on the income statement. It'll show up as pledged, and it'll be in the January numbers, and this working capital number will get larger still. So, at the end of January, I'm expecting this number to be closer to 100,000 than the rather slender 5,800 that we show right here. We had slightly higher rent deposits because we re-rented St. John's House for the start of the year, and so that meant a rent deposit. That's cash that we can't spend, that we've got to keep ready if that person moves. We had fund principal. So this, by the way, this is the net number. what we'll see in January for the time to build up campaign. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. And then we have the restricted funds. That's off of that restricted budget. You can go, we ended the year with 172. That's where that shows up. And this is where our endowment funds show up. And our total net liabilities matches net assets. So we're feeling pretty good about where we're starting the year, having a balance sheet that's in good shape. But going into next year, and this is one of the things we have to remember, that COVID is at least a 2-year series of shifts for us, at least on the financial front. And a lot of times it's not the first year that hits, it's the second year that hits. We still have an opportunity cost of not being able to do everything that we want to do on congregational development in delivering our strategic plan. And that's going to have an impact on next year's budget. So some of the, I'm going to call them headwinds. It's perhaps not fair. Some of these are going to be investment choices, but and these are going to be things that the Vestry needs to wrangle on. The first one, which they already have, is choices on salary and pension. So like any company, if you've ever heard the term a merit increase, the diocese specifies some increases as long as you're at the minimum spend level. We make choices based on that diocesan guidance, and the salary and pension increase is worth about $15,000 of extra spending for next year. Healthcare cost increases are going to hit to the tune of $3,000. We estimate that we're going to have some incremental administrative program expenses. That's not inflation. It's not getting sloppy on spending. It's a current estimate that the church will reopen around mid-year. And when it reopens, expenses go up because having things that we do live ends up costing us a little bit more. It's a good thing, but it's money that's going to have to be allocated into the budget. We're going to have requests out for between $35,000 and $45,000 for congregational development and youth development expenditures. This is a place we're going to have conversation. Can we afford all of that when all is said and done? Or do we have to stagger some of these investments? But the goal will be to fulfill this as much as we can. We also understand that the St. John's House may be coming back up for rental, and we're going to need to re-rent it quickly because that's $4,000 a month of lost income when we're not re-renting. So that's a headwind for us. And the campus improvement team, and I have to also give a call out to Laura Kroger, who does the best job in keeping us informed as a finance committee about what information they're going to be proposing, working with us to figure ways to make investment choices for the campus improvement projects. She's persistent. She has a wonderful group working. She's been persistent, but she's also been collaborative, and it has been just a joy to work on that. So kudos to the campus improvement team. Some tailwinds, because we do have some tailwinds. The flat pledge income, we were worried about because we made such a big stretch last year. Could we hold on to that? And the answer now is yes. We're going to have the numbers that allow us to be flat. And quite frankly, if we close a few more pledges, we might actually be able to show some increase. I think we may have some improved pledge collection opportunities. $9,000 is a high end, but this year we have more unfulfilled pledges. Every year you have some pledges that sort of made it 90%, and that last gift hasn't made it in yet, and you have to make sure you collect that money. Last year was an unusually low number. We could only budget for $2,000. I'd never seen a number that low because people fulfilled their pledges last year amazingly well. This year, it was a more normal year that way, but it means it actually moves a little bit more money into this year's budget, and that's a good thing. We are proposing and pushing for Vestry. to do some sort of fundraiser auction, whether that's online or live or a reopening event. And although we had $7,000 worth of auction for this year, one of the discretionary choices is we could always choose to apply all of the money in 1 year as opposed to over 2 years. It's one of those areas we have some budget flexibility on. And with Montessori coming in, if we're able to retain them for a full year, and if we're able to get started up rentals, which we have been clearing space on for flexible rental space, we could potentially see a $30,000 to $50,000 improvement in non-residential rent income. You put those two columns together, right now we have more headwinds than we have tailwinds. That will be the fun conversation that Vestry will have at the retreat and at their first full financial Vestry conversation to figure out how we bring those two things into balance. Or if we are confident in forgiveness of the PPP loan, is this year that we decide to take a modest deficit into for our financials. And so if I were summarizing all of this, we for the budget, some other things we can do is look to the restricted gifts and see, are there things that we can be doing that accelerate that spending that would be really helpful and reduce pressure on our operating budget. Something a lot of people are not aware of, we have a small amount of rainy day funds that Vestry set aside. The third area, as we look to bring those two together, is would we reduce ministry requests? By the way, I think probably not, but it's always a discretionary item. And then the other is to have conversations about new fundraising opportunities. So we're going to have some fun conversations on bringing that together and giving us a full balanced budget, or at least a planned deficit that we know achieves financial goals. So we ended 2020 in a really good way. We are sound financially. We have a 2021 where we're going to try to do a lot of things. So that's going to create budgeting challenges, but also opportunities. And quite frankly, the biggest source of our capacity to unleash our talent onto things is going to be the steadfast support of the congregation, because the biggest source of revenue that we have is going to be really coming from our pledge income and our congregational income. And so with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and I'm going to come back in live and see if there are any questions. And Andrew, did you have any questions?
I could start feeding you a couple of questions that came up from David and also John. First one has to do, I'm just putting it in the chat, where he's asking about funds from foundations and how those grants might be sunsetting here, and whether or not we're aware of any future grants that might replace those or somehow be a factor, a positive factor.
Yeah, so that, by the way, is a really good question. This was one thing Lila always counseled, that we need to remember that the grants we receive are not forever grants. They're not, they have been remarkably consistent. They have been greatly appreciated, but we are smart and wise to make sure that we plan for turnover on those grants. And we were very pleased that the grants remained stable in the current year. We are, and in fact, John was this past week working on new grants. and I appreciate that John Owens has taken the initiative to find grant-making opportunities for us. I think some of his broader diocesan connections and linkages are helpful for that. So while we are working to make sure we maintain our current grant cycle, we're also doing some planning for the future. And I think that's actually a little bit of feather in John's cap for keeping his eyes open on that.
The next question is, and I'll sort of bounce back and forth. So I just answered one, thank you for that with David Brown's question. So I'll jump to John Seale's question here. He asked, will this report include the endowment committee growth, or is that something, I know that was mentioned in the annual report.
Yeah, the financial package does include in two places. It'll reference the endowment growth. One area that it does this is on the restricted budget page, which I believe is in that financial package, is page 7 in the financial package at the bottom. It also is reflected in the liabilities section on the statement of assets and liabilities. And the one of the things that I think would be a great thing, and John, I don't know if you and the endowment committee would be up for, but I think it would be helpful first as a vestry, part of a vestry meeting and then part of a congregational meeting as well, is to actually introduce everyone to the endowment, its performance, and how the endowment committee is currently managing it. The finance committee does not, and it's important to understand, like in I think correct financial procedure should have its own management committee. It's different. And John Seales has been a wonderful sort of leader and protector of how we think about our endowment. And I know Susan Pierpoint, who was so important in setting that up, has been involved over time as well. So we just sort of put the bottom line summary, but at some point, John, if you would be open, I would help get some time on both the vestry calendar and the congregational calendar to share some of that information.
Well, if I might chime in, Jim, since Tim Johnson is coming back on the vestry and he's also on the endowment committee, I think it would be great to coordinate the discussion and conversation as to and setting some goals with the vestry's help in that subject, endowment and legacy giving. So I'm looking forward to this being a good year and moving ahead on that subject. Excellent.
Excellent. I'm happy, by the way, to see Tim, because Tim has all these things. He's like former finance committee, former warden, endowment committee. So he's great to have involved in that.
Thanks for saying that. I'll send you that $100 today.
I didn't even know Upraise Marketing.
Yeah, that's me. I haven't put my face on today.
Okay, Tim, the check's in the mail. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Andrew.
Yes, and then I was frantically trying to find. So the next question from David, and this was discussed at the most recent vestry meeting. So I can get back to you on this. But Jim, maybe you know off the top of your head, maybe you don't. I don't know. What is our bonus program? How long have we been doing that?
Oh, that's a good history question. We have traditionally had a little bit of a small bonus pool to acknowledge sort of above and beyond performance during the course of the year, usually at a combination of the rector and the personnel committee's recommendations. This year, we did not actually have a bonus set aside, and there were a couple reasons for that. One big reason was we moved the staff into a better healthcare plan, which had some incremental health and benefits to those people who receive healthcare. The second was we had set up some unearmarked reserve funds to give us a little bit more flexibility with the budget so that we could still make those choices during the course of the year. And I think the third thing is in this COVID year, we wanted to be, tight on our cash management. There was a recommendation that is being made, or personnel committee has submitted into their budget request for reestablishing that. But that pool is a discretionary pool, David, not a sort of you get 80% base pay and 20% bonus that you might see in a corporate setting where people have a certain expectation on that. As
The
to
$1,500 that was shown on page 1, is that a non-staff expense for 2020?
I'll parking lot that one, David. I'll have to go back in and have Sebastian pull you to get
Great.
give you an accurate answer on that.
Okay.
Okay, Andrew, next question.
And then, so again, from David, we have 10 funds which have balances of under $1,000, referencing page 7 of the packet. While some will build up, should we consider dropping some restricted funds as per the guidance of the state of California? Good example is the Columbarium Fund of $1,545. Can some funds be consolidated? Question.
Yes. So, that's a really good question. I think this is like the senior warden's question, which any senior warden always asks those same questions. We actually closed off a couple funds this year, and as soon as we did that, a couple new ones sprouted up. And when you get the new monies in, you're usually, you have a choice as to whether you're going to accept those gifts or not, and you can accept the restrictions. But usually they're things that are at that point in time so blindingly obvious that you say, yes, please, I love this idea. And you bring that money in. Now, you mentioned certain things, and the Columbarium Fund is a very interesting one because it's restricted to a columbarium, and that's of course a big question mark. I think our general philosophy on it is where we can wind a fund down totally, we do it. So we did that with technology improvements this year, which ended up at a zero balance. Where funds can be combined because the donor restrictions will still be met, we have done a couple of that, and we do that with Vestry visibility to that. And the one space as you look at funds, if there is a fund that that isn't being spent, that's the one you have to say, do I need to go back to the donors and ask if they have any flexibility on the restriction, or should I send the money back? The good news is we don't have many of those. And Columbarium is one that we probably should have further conversation on. One that will probably get merged next year is COVID relief, because COVID relief, we bring money in through COVID relief, but we spend it out through Rector's discretionary. So we'll probably merge those two funds together during the course of next year. The other one that has been a question mark is Elder Ministries, which is under InReach. And a very interesting thing on that is, because that question has come up in prior years, like, what should we do with that? And John came on board and said, oh, are those funds that I could apply to XYZ programs? So I think some funds that were lying a little fallow, that we may actually spend that account down. So we are looking for ways to simplify this a little bit.
Good. Thank you. And due to the lateness of the hour, Jim and Andrew, I'll just take, if I can have a conversation with you later on, let's take the rest of these off the table and talk about them in the parking lot.
Yes, I would. I appreciate that, because you had an excellent list of questions. And the good news, David, is I can answer all of those because we asked them in the process of putting the financial package together.
Fantastic. I hope everybody on this call realizes how fortunate we are to have Jim and the rest of the people who are leading us through these very difficult times. All churches did not successfully navigate 2020. So bravo, Jim, and to Andrew and to others.
Bravo.
Yeah.
Okay. And Andrew, were there any other questions that we should get to, or is this a nice time for us to wrap up with a quick close?
I think it's good for a quick close. I think we caught all the questions.
Fran Toy.
Oh, the toy. Oh, sorry. Fran Toy had, thank you. May I ask what the toy scholarship funds were used for, if we know that, or is that something we need a parking lot?
I know one thing that they were used for, and so it's a partial answer, Fran, which is part of those were used for retreat scholarships. And I would have to break out the pieces that were used for that. So, and I was actually thinking you might ask the question, but I didn't have time to do a detailed page specifically on the scholarship. So if I could parking lot the details of that. Okay. And I see that Scott is on the call. Scott, do you have any closing thoughts or comments for us?
Got to remember to take my mute off. I would just say again, thank you, Jim and Andrew, for all the work that you've done and for the clarity of the presentation and the detail. And we're so grateful for what you've done and continue to do. It's a lot to keep track of. So thank you.
Well, this has been a really wonderful year for it to do a little baptism by fire. I know the balance sheet better this year than I ever have before. More individual budget items.
Yeah.
I feel like the finance committee is in a stronger place as well. So again, I want to thank everyone who's provided help and advice and provides the financial wherewithal for us.
And just an example too of given something we could never have predicted in any budgetary planning, the missional kind of response from the whole group of people who decided that this was the time to do a Christmas drive-through, which was a big budget item. Ultimately, there were lots of wonderful, generous donations, but I appreciate Jim's agility in helping us navigate some of that, because it was, for those that you don't know, I think John, there was 620 cars that came through, or is that I think Carol,
625.
625 car loads came through. And what did I think you just mentioned, Carol, there were a number of people who are now on our permanent email list.
We know directly from that just 27 people signed up for our Friday emails, or our emails.
Yeah.
And also we collected a fair amount of money for Vision, right? I think more than $1,000.
Yeah.
I think it just engaged the community, and we have more people coming to our services now.
Right. Yeah, I think when with all these changes and the swiftness of which we try to respond to those changes, I feel like our financial structure and leaders have been really responsive to those changes and allowed us to complete our mission.
I just want to say that I really, really agree, and bravo so much for Jim and the whole committee. It was so well done, and you were so clear and on top of it. It just makes us all understand what's happening so much better, so we can move forward to this coming year with this deeper understanding. Great, thank you. I mean, it's a lot of work, I know. And
Okay. Well, by the way, thank you, Carol, for that comment. That it's been a good year for the Finance Committee. We all appreciate that. And the other thank you that we should all keep making, by the way, is our financial setup, our ability to track and manage things is so much better than it was, 7 or 8 or 9 years ago. And there is an amazing amount of work that we have never fully acknowledged that went into that from Lila Green. And every day we see Lila, we should be thanking Lila for setting up a system that allows us to track and manage our business effectively.
Amen.
well, we're an amazing congregation that's doing amazing things right now. So let's keep it up.
Okay. I'm not sure who wraps us up, but I'll say thank you very much. It's been wonderful. If anyone has further questions, feel free to reach out to myself, Andrew, Randy Lewandowski, or any member of our finance team.
That's what you guys are doing.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Jim, so much.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Andrew.
Jim.
Thank you. See you all.
Okay.
Lunchtime.
Thank you, Lila. Thank you, Jim.